What language did Jesus speak? Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek? Probably all the above. What language did he speak the most? Well, let's find out. So grab your coffee and let's dig into the historical, cultural, and textual evidence and dig a little deeper. So we took a poll. What language did Jesus speak? We asked anybody, all the viewers, and 8% said Hebrew was the language Jesus spoke the most. 85 Aramaic, 8% Greek, and we really didn't get much in the way of comments saying other languages. And I was a little surprised about that. I thought somebody would say, of course, he spoke Spanish. His name was Jesus. But no, that was not one of the list. It was indeed Aramaic. So which language did Jesus speak the most? If we look at the first century Judea, we'll get pictures of what the different atmosphere and the multicultural area that Jesus was in, and how those different languages in that area influenced the way that he grew up and the different languages that he would have been speaking. So let's take a look at diving into that a little bit more. What evidence is there about this? Well, he would have been growing up. Jesus would have been growing up as a Jew, and as that would have been exposed to learning the Hebrew scriptures, the Tanakh. And this is the law, the prophets, and the writings, which were the first 5 books of the Bible being the law, the prophets being the minor and major prophets of the Old Testament. The writings were all the historical writings plus the poetic books as well. So he would have learned all that, and that would have been he would have learned that in Hebrew. Then you have the other reasons that he would have picked it up. It would have been used in liturgical settings all the time. When he grew up in the synagogue and the temple, he would have seen the Hebrew text being spoken and being read aloud in there. And also he would have participated in this as well. So he would have learned how to read, and not only just speak Hebrew, but also to read it. In the temple in Jerusalem, priests and Levites would have used Hebrew in various rituals and ceremonies. The Hebrew Bible contains detailed instructions how to do things in how to perform temple worship, and reinforcing Hebrew in these settings. And it was also a big part of his educational background. So the last point there is, it was also in the Qumran scrolls. And we're going to come back to that a little bit, because this is a key element that helps tie everything together to say, these were the languages that people spoke in that region. There really isn't much of a question about it. Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. So is there any textual evidence for this? And we would say so. We can look at Luke chapter 4, verses 16 and 17. And he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. And as was the custom, he went to the synagogue in the Sabbath, and he stood up to read. He wasn't reading in Aramaic. He wasn't reading in Greek or Latin or any other language. He was reading in Hebrew. And the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, and he reads the text. Well, that's one spot. So as far as what language Jesus spoke, we know both historically and also scripturally, culturally. The textual evidence is there. Jesus did speak Hebrew. What about Aramaic? First of all, what is Aramaic? Aramaic is a language that is not Arabic. Don't confuse the two. Although they're both Semitic languages, there are many Semitic languages besides Hebrew, Aramaic, Arabic. There's also languages down in Ethiopia that were Semitic. There's Malta. There's Akkadian, which is now an extinct language. There were many other sister languages that were there, but this is Aramaic and not Arabic. The Arabic we know today was not even spoken in the first century. It wasn't even a developed language, what we have either today or during the time of Muhammad. It was not the same language. Aramaic was originally spoken by the Arameans who dwelled in present-day Syria, Iraq, and Turkey. And after they were incorporated into the Assyrian Empire, Aramaic became the official language in that region. And from the 7th century BC, two variants of that language developed. One was Imperial Aramaic that was written and used for legal terms and legal documents. We did a live stream on this a while back talking about 3 reasons why Hebrew is a special language. And we covered some of these earlier developments with this. So Western Aramaic was the common or street language spoken by Samaritans and Jews in the first century. That was the regular language that Jesus would have spoken on the street. So you have the liturgical language that is spoken in the temple and in synagogues and in readings. When you read the scrolls, you would read it in Hebrew. But when you're on the street and you're talking to people, you're in the market, you're going to be speaking Aramaic. So there were a couple of cases where Jesus is actually talking to, or there's a couple of cases in the New Testament where it mentions him speaking Aramaic. And in Mark 14:36, it says, and he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but you will. This is a very intimate moment for Jesus. He is there on his knees before the Father in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's praying. And this is, the rubber meets the road. He knows what's before him. And although he is God, he and the Father are one, he is approaching the first person of the Trinity and saying, this is rough. I really don't want to do this. We know it needs to be done. I'm submitting myself to your will. Let's get this finished. And it was tough. And he addresses God as Father, using the Arabic term, not Arabic, the Aramaic term, Abba. He says, Abba, Father, which is a very endearing term. It's the daddy. It's like saying daddy in English. It's what the child would say to the father. He's saying, I really don't want to do this because it's going to hurt. But I know on the other end, we're going to get what we're looking for in this and having a redeemed people. He also uses Aramaic a few hours later when he's on the cross. And when it was about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice saying, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? And it was said in such a way, some people thought he was crying out to Elijah because of the way he was saying. So phonetically, if you look at these first 2 words here, it lines up with Elijah. He was speaking Aramaic. So we have textual evidence of Jesus speaking Hebrew. We have textual evidence of Jesus speaking Aramaic. We know by the cultural and historical context that was both languages were used in the region. So we can mark those both off. These are languages that Jesus spoke. Well, what about Greek? Well, if you remember, we were looking on a previous video, we looked at how Greek spread across the region because of Alexander the Great. His conquering in that area brought not only the language of Greek, but Greek thought and Greek culture called in a process called Hellenization. The Greek word for Greek is Hellenica. Oh gosh, I'm going to mispronounce it. Helenikia. Sorry, Helenikia is more the modern pronunciation for it, but it's Hellenization. We're bringing Greek to these other places, and when he did that, it really stuck. So much so that when the Romans came in later, the language on the western side of the Roman Empire was mostly Latin, but on the eastern side of the Roman Empire, it was Greek. The remnant of Alexander the Great's influence in Hellenization stuck. There were still cities that were out there that were devoted to that way of life because it was very practical. It made sense. People stuck with it. And so in the eastern side of the Roman Empire, and this is marked as 330 BC, but it still was significantly spoken in the first century. So this was the common language. You had Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Here's a map that shows the languages of the Byzantine Empire. Now this was hundreds of years later, but it still had the remnants of what would have been in the first century. And so you see the Greek, this sort of purplish color out here in Greece and Anatolia, modern day Turkey. And in Inner Anatolia, you had their own native languages that were spoken here, Armenian, the yellow up in the north. But in this entire region on the coast of the Mediterranean, the eastern coast, they spoke Aramaic. Now remember, this is remnants left over from the Assyrian Empire when they had conquered this region and spread the Semitic language of Aramaic out in that region. It was still in common use, even though the Romans took it, even though Alexander the Great swept through and Greek came with him. Still on the streets in this region, you spoke it. Now I'm going to zoom up into this one section right here, which is in the region of what they called Judea at the time. You see that there are a couple of regions here that are pockets of Greek scattered around. So there were some places that still on the streets themselves spoke Greek, especially in a region called the Decapolis. And that was an area that would be in modern day Jordan. It's across the Jordan River. And you have all these black dotted cities. There were 10 of them, the Decapolis, so 10 cities in that region where Jesus or where people there spoke primarily Greek. These were the culture was there, not just speaking Greek, but it was the flat out the culture. And if you look at the second map, the Decapolis actually crossed the Jordan River into this region. So all these different cities that were here, Jesus crossed. These arrows show where Jesus ministry, where his path went. He crossed around this region, but through it. And many times he had people from this region coming to speak to him. And the common language of the empire in the eastern side was Greek. In order for him to converse with them, he would have needed to speak Greek, or they would have to speak Aramaic. Also, he grew up in Nazareth, this region right here. Well, you can see his neighbors not too far away. This is not a great distance. He has neighbors who speak Greek. He would have been picking this up. So there's no doubt about this. Also, the disciples would have done the same thing. And we can take a look at in a later live stream of why the New Testament was written in Greek if the Jewish disciples spoke Aramaic and Hebrew. Maybe they also spoke Greek, and maybe there's a reason behind that. So we'll dig into that in a later one. But for right now, I think it's safe to say that Jesus also spoke Greek. So why didn't Jesus go to the Decapolis and other Greek cities in the region? They were right there. Why didn't he go to them? Well, his mission wasn't to those group of people. Right then, at that point, he was to go to the Jewish people, first to the Jews, and then later the gospel would go to the Gentiles. So Jesus sent out, this is in Matthew 10, 5 through 6. Jesus sent out the 12 with these instructions. Go nowhere among the Gentiles and enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of Israel. He was giving them direct instructions to go just to Jewish people, not to anybody else, because that's what their mission was. But there is other examples where they came to him, and in those cases, he may have had to spoke their languages. Great crowds followed him. This is Matthew 4:25. Great crowds followed him from Galilee, the Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and the regions across the Jordan. Remember, that's where on the other side of the Jordan, you get some people that are speaking other languages there. Across the Jordan to follow him. So from Galilee, you have Aramaic speakers. In the Decapolis, you have Greek speakers. And in Jerusalem, you have Hebrew speakers, at least around the temple, in the temple, and all the activities that are surrounding the temple. They spoke Hebrew. So I think it's safe to say that Jesus spoke Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, and the most common language he would have spoken would have been to the people that he's delivering the message to, which would have been the Jews, in Aramaic. He's speaking directly to them. So I mentioned earlier about the Qumran scrolls. These are the Dead Sea Scrolls that were discovered in the last century, buried, and this is such an amazing find. They were well preserved. This is a dry area. They were in jars and kept dry. And those preservations themselves, the scrolls themselves, were written from way back in the 6th century BC all the way up through the 1st century AD. And you see those scrolls are written in Aramaic, Hebrew, and Greek. And so there's different sections that are written in each part. Primarily, the ones that were written in the 1st century were written in Aramaic. And that influence, you see, this then would add some extra evidence to the fact that people in that region spoke those languages. Now, I see that we have some comments, so I was hoping it was going to be about the Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic. Hello, how are you? That works. Okay, so I think we can say that this is, we're pretty much looking at, these are the languages that Jesus spoke. Aramaic was the primary language that Jesus spoke. And then the disciples, I did mention this, the disciples would have spoken the languages that Jesus spoke as well, because they're in the same region, they're in the same area, the same reasons that Jesus would have spoken these languages, the disciples would have spoken these languages. Now, I did mention earlier the question about why did the disciples then write the Bible in Greek? If they were Jews and he said, go to the lost sheep, and he is focused mostly on the Jews in Judea and Samaria. No, I'm sorry, not in Samaria, just the Jews in Judea and in the Galilee region. Why would his disciples then focus on a more universal language that would carry it not just to Samaria, where the Samaritans were, but also beyond? Well, that had to do with the Great Commission when he said, go out into all the world. This is his last command to his disciples. Go out into all the world, from Jerusalem to Judea and to the uttermost parts of the earth. So they're fulfilling that that great command that Jesus sent them out with, that last wish, that last command that he said, go do this. And so if they were just to write it in Hebrew, it would have stayed in the temple. If they were to write it just in Aramaic, it would have just stayed in Judea. If they were to write it in Greek, well, now they're encompassing at least the Eastern Mediterranean. And then it goes from there. So I think we pretty much have summed it up as a pretty much proven that these were the languages Jesus spoke, and this was the primary language was Aramaic. So if you like this material, please let me know. If you want to see more, please subscribe. We have coming up in the next couple of weeks, in the next week, we're going to be focusing in on, believe it or not, going from New Testament languages to Godzilla. And why do we do this? Because we're taking something that was scripture, and we're trying to give it out to the world. We're trying to get a message out to the way the people would communicate. And the way that people communicate a lot today is through the media, through the movies. You can bring up stories through movies, and if you extract something that has an eternal message out of that, something that Jesus would have liked to have brought to the masses, then you can use this as to speak to other people. That's the whole focus of why we do that. We sit down and we say, okay, how can we think of entertainment biblically? How can we get these messages that God has out there? Maybe it's probably not even intended by the people who wrote, directed, acted in these movies. But there are usually some messages that can be brought out. Not all the time, but usually there are. So we're going to take a look at Godzilla. The movie Godzilla -1 is coming out soon. Every day this week, we're going to look at a different era within the Godzilla history. We're looking at 1954 through 1975, the Showa era. And the day after that, on Wednesday, we're going to look at the next era, Heisei area. And that is 1984 to 1995. So until then, keep looking for those eternal truths. And we'll see you on the next show.